Right, so the Grudem article I just handed you was on the age of the Earth, and that's kind of where we left off last week. That's the main thing that we were talking about. I'll just do a quick review in case you weren't here. The question was, when were dinosaurs on the Earth, and did they live at the same time of humans? So we examined the photographic evidence first. And we said, obviously, the answer is yes.
Case closed.
Yeah. So really the question comes down to how old the Earth is. If you believe in an old Earth and kind of the what is the prevalent scientific theory and consensus in a lot of ways, then the old Earth view, where the universe is about 15 or 13, almost 14 billion years old, was a more precise number as I was doing some reading today about it. Earth about 4.5 billion years old. Early man appearing about 2.5 million years ago. Then humans in mostly the form you would recognize today, anywhere between 20,000 and 90,000 years ago, depending on who you ask and what fossils you're going by and how you classify all those. And then with the dinosaurs being quite a bit before that, being between 250 million and 65 million years ago. So in that time frame, dinosaurs and humans do not overlap, if you believe in an old Earth viewpoint. But if you believe in a young Earth viewpoint, which is a creationist viewpoint that God created the world pretty much fully formed somewhere between 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, are the numbers that you hear most commonly formed, then obviously everything would have been created there when God created the world, and humans and dinosaurs would have coexisted at that time. So those are kind of the two different options, and that's really going to determine whether you believe humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time, was whether you believe in a young Earth or an old Earth. Now, we looked at some passages in the Bible that seem to refer to animals, large animals, that were not specified exactly what they are, and the different terms are behemoth, leviathan, and then dragon or monster is the way it's translated in a lot of different places. We looked at some of those passages last week. So basically from that, what we said was the Bible seems to allow, if we take a young Earth viewpoint and we say that humans and dinosaurs did exist, there are descriptions in the Bible that we could say this sounds like a dinosaur. So it's possible to fit dinosaurs into that framework and believe that they did coexist at some point, and that some of the descriptions and at least legends of their past existence at the time the Bible was written still were available. So it's not impossible from a biblical standpoint. We talked, this was kind of where we left off last week. We said if we get the information coming from all around us telling us that the scientific view, quote unquote, is that the Earth is billions of years old, and that man was created, or early man appeared about 2.5 million years ago. So when you hear this over and over again on TV shows that talk about origins from different places, if you watch debates on the topic, if you read books, you read the newspaper about fossils that are found, or all this kind of stuff, they're all going to be working from this framework. And I said, if you take the evidence that's out there, what are the ways that somebody could still hold to a young Earth viewpoint? So these were the three of the main important ways that I want you to be aware of. First of all is unreliable radiometric dating methods. That's one of the main things that young Earth creationists will point to and say that even though scientists like to point to the idea that these radio dating methods point to fossils and rocks being millions and even billions of years old, that there's a lot of problems that are not commonly articulated when those dates are given. So that even though it sounds like a pretty sure thing when you look down an article in the encyclopedia or in a book and it says this fossil was 2.5 million years ago and this fossil was 1.8 million years ago, then that seems to come with some kind of authority that young Earth creationists will argue it doesn't really entail, because what it's really doing is just fitting evidence into a preformed framework. So those unreliable radiometric dating methods are one thing that young Earth creationists will say, look, I know you say the Earth is old, but the dating methods you're using are not as reliable as you're saying, and we think we have another framework that you can fit that same evidence into. The second is geologic catastrophe. How can you have layers of sediment and fossils being formed and everything? What a lot of young Earth creationists will say is basically in the flood of Genesis 6, a worldwide flood, the Earth, there was great upheaval in the Earth and its systems and the way everything worked, and that animals were completely covered by rock and formed fossils in that way, and that's the reason you see some of the different rock formations, and all these kinds of things that you hear about would take millions or billions of years to form can be explained by the flood, is what these young Earth creationists will say. And they think that it's possible that that may have also changed the some elements about how radiometric dating actually works. So those two things are somewhat related in some scenarios. And then the last one we said was creation with the appearance of age, which we know did happen because Adam was created with the appearance of age. The trees in the garden were created with the appearance of age because Adam ate fruit. So if you are a young Earth creationist, you believe that God created things already appearing to be at least in a somewhat mature state. So it's possible that God created an Earth and a solar system and even an entire universe that may appear to be older than it actually is. The example that I gave you last week was if you took a one-day-old Adam to the doctor and said, "How old is this man?" He would have said 20 or 25 or 30 years old, most likely. And if you would have said to this doctor, "No, 24 hours ago, he didn't exist," the doctor would say, "You are crazy, that all the evidence points to him being much, much older than that." So that is in some ways an important factor to consider, in that basically young Earth creationists can say, even if all the evidence out there points to the universe being 15 billion years old, I can still believe that God created 6,000 or 10,000 years ago, and it just appears to look that old. So even if completely backed into a corner, the young Earth creationist still has a way out. Now, that's kind of a scenario, and there's a lot of details to that. There's some more evidence that young Earth creationists would point to say we believe that there is some scientific evidence for our viewpoint. There are some places that that they can make a fairly convincing case about this. There's other places that, and I'm not a scientific expert by any means, so you have to take what I'm saying here with a grain of salt. I'm no expert in these issues. But there's some places that I think they can make a fairly convincing case on some of these things. There's some other things that it seems to me like it's a little bit of a stretch. So here's kind of how I would explain it to you. If Ken Ham, who's the prominent young Earth creationist guy, if I was trying to get to Fairfield and and I was walking down the road and he pulled up beside me in his young Earth creationist car and said, "Hop in, I'll give you a ride," I would say, "Ken Ham, I'm not quite ready to get in the car with you yet. I'm not quite ready to buy into the idea that all of this radiometric dating method and all of this scientific information that seems to indicate an older universe. I'm not sure I'm satisfied with all of your explanations. I'm not quite sure that I'm convinced by that. I want to leave open the possibility that all those things are right. And the more details you read about it, I think the more plausible it sounds in some ways. But then you'll read rebuttals from either evolutionists or sometimes Christians who are old Earth creationists, for example. And they'll say, I'm not quite sure that the young Earth creationists are quite being fair with all the information. So with the limited amount of information that I have about it, and I'll tell you, man, I spent some time reading about it last week and even some more time today. I spent most of the day reading about some of the different facets of this issue, and it just makes your head spin trying to go around and figure out all the details about fossils and radiocarbon dating and all the different kinds of radiometric, whatever the exact term is, the dating methods that they use and everything. You read one side and it sounds like that makes a good point, and then you read the other side, and I just don't have the tools to evaluate all that.
What's the difference? What difference does it make?
Well, the main difference that it makes is, I mean, at the end of the day, one of the things that I want to say is that I think Christians can agree to disagree on the age of the earth. I don't think that's something that we need to part fellowship over. If we have people in our church, some of them believe in an old universe, or some of them believe in a new universe, I don't think that's something that we have to argue and beat at each other's throats about. So at one level, I say, I think there's a lot that's true about that it doesn't matter at one level. But at another level, it does affect a lot of different things about the way you look at the world and how you interpret, especially the first few chapters of the Bible. So there's one level where there's some significance, and it's important. I think, just at least to be aware of the possibilities of what's out there and what different people think about.
But who shot candy and where's Jimmy Hopper body and who cares?
Yeah, I mean, at one point you do get to that where we're here in the world today, and the origins of how we got here. We don't have a video camera to go back and document it. We can't go back and see. So, at one level, I think that that's certainly true.
Isn't ultimately, though, the goal of the secular to take God out of the equation completely? And if you take out the first few chapters of Genesis, whether you extended it, they want to take out that he breathed into existence. They want the Big Bang Theory. That's why they need the 15 billion years. That's why they need the 2.4 million years. That's why they need all these long years, because they're trying to take God out of the equation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, ultimately, I think that is one of the areas that scientists who are evolutionists are not completely honest in not fairly evaluating the case that creationists make sometimes. Is the fact is that they're not willing to even consider the fact or the idea that this same data may fit into a different framework. And that's where we're going to go with the next slide, is how do we fit the data into the different frameworks and everything. So these are some of the main lines of argument that the young Earth creationists will use. All right? Yeah.
The two old Earth and young Earth paradigms that you presented, I mean, you got to, like you said a couple weeks ago, as long as you believe in the exclusive creation of man, right, then we can talk about the rest.
Yeah.
But the old Earth paradigm that you present doesn't provide for that.
Yeah, that's right. Now there are some intermediate positions in there. Those are just kind of the two prevalent ones.
Sure.
And I would say that the place that we do start to have an issue theologically speaking is with the special creation of Adam, that he is a being that God created specially, not just evolving over millions of years.
Yeah. And
suddenly, okay, now he bears the image of God at some point. That's a major obstacle for the evolutionary view that I don't think that there's a legitimate way to cross from a biblical worldview.
Yeah.
Is when does man actually become God's image bearer, morally culpable? When does he become man and not animal anymore? So I think that is a hurdle, and that's a place where I start to get very nervous when people tell me I'm a creationist, or I'm a Christian, and I believe in evolution basically in the complete sense of, I just believe that God directed it. I start to get real nervous about that. If you say I believe that maybe the Earth is millions or billions of years old, and that maybe some of the species evolved, and maybe there was some elements of evolution that were true, but God still created Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, then I say, okay, I'm not sure if I'm willing to go. I'm not willing to get in that car with you either yet. I'm still going to walk down the Fairfield myself, but I'm not necessarily going to part company with somebody over that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about three problems with the old Earth view that I think they have a really hard time answering if they're being honest with it. First of all, the fossil record doesn't really show gradual changes between species. This is one of the things that Charles Darwin actually admitted was one of the weakest elements of his theory back when he wrote Origin of the Species. And he said it's just because we don't have enough fossils yet. When we find more, we'll see the evidence. Well, the fact is that as we found more and more fossils, the evidence has not shown a gradual change between species, but has actually shown fully formed species as we know them very, very often, with some partial fragment fossils that are often debatable as far as, particularly talking about between man and ape. What does this skull fragment, what category does this skull fragment? There's often a debate about which one does it fit in. And that's often where these transitional fossils are made to, are made from, is evidence that's difficult to draw as strong a conclusions as the picture that I think evolutionists want to paint. I got a great quote from Wayne Grudem on this issue as well. So here's another from Grudem on this. You can pass that around. Let me read it to you. I printed it out so you could take it with you, and then I gave you the footnotes on the back. Here's what he says. The fossil record was Darwin's greatest problem in 1859, and it has simply become a greater problem since then. In Darwin's time, hundreds of fossils were available showing the existence of distinct kinds of animals and plants in the distant past, but Darwin was unable to find any fossils from intermediate types to fill in the gaps between distinct kinds of animals. Fossils showing some characteristics of one animal and a few characteristics of the next developmental type, for example. In fact, many ancient fossils exactly resemble present-day animals, showing that, according to the chronological assumptions of his view, numerous animals that have persisted for millions of years, essentially unchanged. Darwin realized that the absence of transitional types in the fossil record weakened his theory, but he thought it was due to the fact that not enough fossils had been discovered, and was confident that further discoveries would unearth many transitional types of animals. However, the subsequent 130 years of intensive archaeological activity has still failed to produce one convincing example of a needed transitional type. Here's now this is from Wayne Grudem's book, and if you read the passage that I gave you from last week, the longer section, you'll know that he does not take a strong stance on is the Earth young or old. He says we can't really know is his position. So this is his words coming from somebody that's not arguing I think the Earth is necessarily young. He's coming at this from a fairly neutral standpoint and saying it may be young, it may be old. I'm not sure. I'm just trying to give you a honest evaluation of the evidence. And he's saying that the fossil record is not pointing toward gradual transitions between species. So here's what he goes on to say there. Johnson quotes noted evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard as saying there are two characteristics of the fossil record that are inconsistent of the idea of gradual change through generations. So this is a prominent evolutionist who's being quoted here. Keep that in mind. Stasis, he says, most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking pretty much the same as when they disappeared. Morphological change is usually limited and directionless. Now that is not at all what you would find if evolution was true. So what evolutionists have gone to say since the fossil record looks like this is that you have a long period where nothing changes and then changes happen very quickly. And that's why you don't see the intermediate stages. So the big changes happen very quickly, and then you have another long period of virtually no change. Which that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense when you consider the way that evolution works. So look at it, the second point that he makes, sudden appearance. In any local area, a species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once in full form. So difficult is this problem for Darwinian evolution that many evolutionary scientists propose that evolution came about in sudden jumps to new forms of life, so that each of the 32 known orders of mammals, for example, appeared quite suddenly in the history of Europe. You know, and if you're just being honest with the evidence, that doesn't sound like it's lending itself to the evolutionary viewpoint. Now, what evolutionists will do is they'll figure out reasons why, okay, maybe the Earth wasn't in a state or things weren't happening so that we would have a consistent record of fossils. Maybe there were times in the Earth's history where we were more likely to get fossils from, but when we look back at the fossil record, even according to the old Earth time scale, taking humans, early humans to late humans, for example, you have fossils coming all along. You don't have a bunch at the beginning that look different from a bunch at the end. It just doesn't look like that. I've got another book I want to tell you a little bit about here that goes through that issue. Let me see if there's anything else on this one I wanted to give you. Look at that last paragraph. Neither of the two fundamental axioms of Darwin's macroevolutionary theory, the concept of the continuity of nature, is the idea of a functional continuum of all life forms linking all species together and ultimately leading back to a primeval cell. And the belief that all the adaptive design of life has resulted from blind random process have been validated by one single empirical discovery or scientific advance since 1859. So that's a pretty strong statement there. And like I said, the footnotes are on the back if you want to trace that out a little bit more. So what's a little bit more about the fossil record? Here's a discovery that was published in 2013, so published last year, on some skulls that were found in modern-day Georgia. And this is called I have no idea if I'm pronouncing this right or not, Dmanisi skull, D-M-A-N-I-S-I, skull. There are 5 skulls that were basically found all together, dated to the same time period. And skull number 5 is the particularly interesting one because the brain cavity was noticeably smaller than what you would expect in some of the supposed later forms of humans. This is a human skull, but it's classified as Homo erectus rather than Homo sapiens. Okay, so this is supposedly an earlier form of human skull. But here's what they've actually found about it when they compared this one with the smaller brain to the other 5. It says, the variation in morphology of all the Dmanisi skulls are so large that had they been discovered on different archaeological sites, they most likely would have been classified as different species. However, all the Dmanisi skulls have the same age and have been found in exactly the same place. So that gives you an interesting perspective on all these different fossils that are found in different places in the world, and they'll take this one and say, well, this one's Homo erectus, and this one's Homo sapiens, and this one's Homo this, and this one's Homo that, because there are a few different elements of them, Homo sapiens, Homo erectus being, I think, the 2 most prominent ones that you see. And they'll look at these small differences between them, and they'll say, well, this one obviously falls in this category, and this one obviously falls in this category. But here you have 5 that are found together and are obviously all belong together, and you have some of them that are exhibiting characteristics of these different groups all together at the same time. So here's what it goes on to say. And this is the Wikipedia article about it. I know Wikipedia is not the greatest, but I don't have in my personal library all these documented sources. So this is just giving you, and this is coming from an evolutionary standpoint. You know, this is not creationists writing the Wikipedia articles. So here's what it says. Faced with the wide variation between Skull 5 and other Dmanisi,
these
skulls, Georgian and University of Zurich researchers were prompted to examine normal variations in modern human skulls and chimpanzee skulls. They found while they looked different from one another, the great variations between all D skulls were no greater than those seen among modern people and among chimpanzees. So humans, there's a variation in the skull formation. Chimpanzees, there's a variation. And these 5D skulls, there's a variation there, and it fits within that variation, even though if they had been found separately, they would have been classified as different species. Consequently, it was entirely possible that such a discrepancy could be found in Homo erectus. So that's what they're trying to do, is figure out where do all these fossils fit. Now, there's a Christian, this guy is a creationist. He wrote a book called Bones of Contention. This one was published back in 1992, but it was, he's revised it, and a new version came out in 2004, which this is the older version of it. And he goes through and he takes the different fossils, which are said to be transitional fossils, and he goes through and he talks about a lot of the different prominent ones and says, look, this is what evolutionary science says about them. Here's some facts about them, and here's, I think, a better way of interpreting them and fitting them into a creationist framework where you're not seeing really a lot of the things that evolutionists are telling us you're seeing in these different fossils. Let me give you just one example or two. Here's a quote from a Time Life book on Homo erectus, which Homo erectus is dated, I believe, usually between 1.7 or 1.8 million years ago to about 300 to 500,000 years ago. So this is a long time ago. I mean, you're talking about it getting close, some as far as 2 million years ago. This is the pre-human species, is what they're saying. This is what they're describing, and this is from a Time Life book on Homo erectus. His bones were heavier and thicker than modern man's, and bigger bones required thicker muscles to move them. These skeletal differences, however, were not particularly noticeable. Below the neck, one expert has noticed, the differences between Homo erectus and today's man could only be detected by an experienced anatomist. So below the neck, you have to be an expert to tell the difference between modern man and this man that lived 1.5 million or 2 million years ago. That doesn't sound like gradual change. I mean, do you know how many years 1 million years is? Mm-hmm. Since the beginning of human civilization has been 5,000 years. I mean, we're talking about Mesopotamia and early Egypt. We're talking about 5,000, maybe 5,500 years. From the pyramids to today, 5,000 years. Now, we're not talking about 10,000 or 100,000. We're talking about 10, 15 times that much of the development of man that's supposed to be this gradual change. And they're saying here that you almost can't even tell the difference below the neck. It just doesn't seem to pass the smell test to me.
Is that time?
Now, like I said, I'm not an expert in this, and there's been some rebuttals to this. I read a rebuttal to this book today online. A guy wrote about a 3 or 4 page article saying why he didn't think this was a fair assessment of it. So there are people that will dispute what he says here. But he makes a pretty convincing case, at least on initial read, I will say. And he deals very seriously with the issues. It's a well-documented book. So, what's happening here is he's taking the same fossils and he's putting them in a different framework. So they've got the evolutionary framework, which is very well established. And then he's taking the same fossils and he's saying, you can fit these in a different way, and I think it makes more sense this way. Now, what evolutionists continue to say is that creationists don't believe in science. You're just ignoring science. And that's really arguing in a circle. Because what they're doing is they're saying, because you're not interpreting this evidence in the way that we interpret it, then you're ignoring it. But what these creation scientists are saying is that, no, we're not ignoring it. We're interpreting it differently than you, and we understand there's a lot of discrepancy here in the two ways that they're being interpreted. But we're not ignoring it, and we're doing science. We're trying to work with the same evidence here. So it's a hot button issue, and it's not going away anytime soon. So, like I said, there are doctors and scientists that believe this viewpoint, although they're certainly in the minority. Now, let me give you one example from this book about, I thought this was a great example of why creation scientists would say that radiometric dating methods are not reliable. There was an archaeological dig in Africa, I believe in Kenya, but I could have the area wrong. And they were finding some fossils around this area, so they wanted to do some some testing to find out the date, and they were going to use radio dating methods to find out the date of it. And they found some volcanic dust that was embedded probably in the bottom of a riverbed at one point. So they found some fossils above the volcanic dust, and then there's the volcanic dust. And they got some samples of this volcanic dust that had turned into rock and had fossilized since then, and they took them to do some tests on it. The initial tests gave results of 212 to 230 million years of age. And here's the response to that. From these results, it was clear that an extraneous argon age discrepancy was present. So in other words, they did these tests that we're told are very reliable for finding the dates of rocks and fossils and things like that. And they get this date of over 200 million years ago. And they say, well, it's clear that an extraneous argon age discrepancy was present. Well, why was that clear? It was clear because there were fossils around it that didn't fit into that evolutionary time frame. That was much, much too old for that rock. So what they said was, well, there was somehow some additional argon got inserted into that rock. Okay, so they redid the dating at that point, and here's some guys named Fitch and Miller were the main ones working on this at this point. They considered that the KBS tuff was very close to 2.6 million years ago. This figure of 2.61 million years ago was widely published in both scientific and popular press. Richard Leakey stated that 1470 was found below rock that was accurately dated and securely dated at 2.6 million years ago. So we've gone from 200 million years to, okay, we've got it better, we've figured out where all this extra argon came from. 2.6 million years ago, this is securely dated and it's accurately dated, are the comments about it. But here's the problem, is that underneath this layer of volcanic rock is found a human skull. And this is dated at 2.6 million years ago, which is older than humans are supposed to be there, because man was supposedly appeared about 2.5 million years ago. So wait a minute, this 1470 skull is a significant archaeological find, and here's what they have to do. They go back and they say, well, wait a minute, this volcanic rock must have been dated wrong. So they go back and they redo some dating, and they pick some different samples. The KBS tuff had been dated 5 different times by 4 different dating methods. The alleged compatibility of 4 different methods would seem to make all this a geologist's dream. What better proof could one want for the reliability of the various dating methods to furnish independent confirmation of the dates for the fossil material? Because 1470 was below rock dated at 2.61 million years ago and above rock dated at 3.18 million years ago, Skull 1470 was estimated to be an incredible 2.9 million years old. Richard Leakey had found the world's oldest fossil belonging to the genus Homo. On the surface, all seemed serene. However, under the surface, paleoanthropology was seething in ferment. Skull 1470, with its estimated date of 2.9 million years, presented the evolutionary world with an intolerable situation. Richard Leakey did not exaggerate when he declared, either we toss out this skull, or we toss out our theories of early man. The problem was quite simple. The theory of human evolution did not allow for a skull so modern in morphology to be that old. So what do? They go back and they take some different samples, and all of these radiometric samples, they're giving really high dates and really low dates, and then some dates in the middle, and they're kind of picking the dates in the middle and saying this is probably more accurate. So they find some other samples in the rock that give them a date which is much more to their liking, which is about 1.6 to 1.8 million years ago. And that fits into the evolutionary scale. And here's what he says. The question arises, how does one know when one has good samples for dating? The only answer to that question is good samples give dates that are in accord with evolutionary presuppositions. Bad samples are ones that give dates not in conformity with evolution, a classic illustration of circular reasoning. So they had firmly dated the volcanic ash. until they realized it couldn't be that old in order to fit into our evolutionary time scale. So we're going to go back and redate the volcanic ash. And I mean, that's basically what happens. And let's see if there's one other quote in here that I wanted to read to you. I mean, that's basically what happened. We continue to be told that it was a secure date based on the precision of radiometric dating and the independent confirmation of other dating techniques that acted as controls. It was the shocking discovery of the morphologically modern skull 1470, located well below the KBS tuff that precipitated the 10-year controversy. Normally, he says, what happens are fossils are discovered first, so they know where in the evolutionary timeline this fossil is supposed to fit. So when they date the rock around it, they know which dates to throw out and which ones to keep, because it's got to fit with what's already there. So it really does end up being circular reasoning. And when you're in this echo chamber of this is what the fossil, this is the place in the timeline it fits, and we've got some radio dating methods that match this, we are going to take those dates and we're going to ignore the ones that don't line up with it because they could be bad samples. You know, and they're honest in doing this. I mean, this is what, they don't think they're doing anything wrong with this. But it's just one example of why I was saying earlier, a lot of creation scientists will say the radio dating methods are not nearly as reliable as we're led to believe. We're told that we can be sure about these kind of things, but here's one that they were sure it was 2.6 million years ago, and then they find something else and suddenly they've got to readjust it to 1.8, which is a significant adjustment from that time period. I mean, you're maybe not quite a 50% adjustment, but pretty close. So, you know, there are some problems there that are not normally being conveyed when you hear scientists talk about it and when you hear about it in the newspaper and all this kind of stuff. So that's one issue. It's the fossil record. Here's one that's more my personal reason. So it could be that if I knew more about it, or if I heard somebody argue the case, that I wouldn't find it as convincing. But I find it incredibly unbelievable that human civilization has suddenly popped up in the last 5,000 years when we are told that modern man began to develop about 2.5 million years ago, and that modern man existed at least 30,000, more likely 50,000, or as much as 90,000 years ago. 50,000 years is probably a good estimate for when most people say that modern man, using tools, developing culture and language, started about 50,000 years ago. So you're telling me basically that man could use tools, could have some basic communication, could hunt large animals 50,000 years ago. And it took them until basically 8,000 years ago is when most people, according to this timeline, say that they began to farm and become agricultural so that they could live in one place and not be hunters and gatherers. So you're telling me that it took them 40,000 years to learn how to plant a garden? Do you know how long 40,000 years is? I mean, we're talking about people that, admittedly, according to the timeline of cultural development, and from an evolutionary timeline, anatomically modern humans arose in Africa about 200,000 years ago and reached behavioral modernity about 50,000 years ago. So what is behavioral modernity? It means they're capable of complex symbolic thought and express cultural creativity. Likely origin of language. They're not sure whether it was a sudden event 50,000 years ago that suddenly flipped the switch, or if it was a gradual accumulation. Here are the characteristics of behavioral modernity. Advanced tools, fishing, trading, basic art, jewelry, games, music, cooking, food, and burial. You begin to see those kind of things about 50,000 years ago. Now, probably, granted their presuppositions, you're going to see it in beginning form then, and it's going to develop some. But you're telling me that from that point, it took them 30,000, 40,000 years to learn how to farm?
I know how they did it. See, God hadn't created the plants and the trees and water yet, so they had nothing to work with. And that's why they couldn't plant farm stuff.
So,
It's close.
I
No.
do everything.
And then what happens at 8,000 years ago, they begin to learn how to farm, so they can form communities and start to build cities and everything. But you have 8,000 years ago up until 5,000 years ago before you have 3,000 years of human civilization and development before you begin to see these early Mesopotamian and Egyptian cultures. 3,000 years. Like I said before, it has been 5,000 years since the Egyptian pyramids to now. And think about how long of a time that's been. I mean, think about how much culture has developed even in just 1,000 years. Think about 1000 AD, in the middle of the Dark Ages. And what has happened in 1,000 years? And you're telling me it took 3,000 years to get from gardening and the beginnings of building cities to the culture of developed culture and writing and archaeologically able to still be found buildings and cultures like that. That just doesn't make any sense. And then, after we get to that point, you're telling me it took about 500 years to get from that to building the pyramids? I mean, if you think about human culture and the development of it, there is a significant high point in the Greek and Roman culture. Now, there are a lot of high points. Egyptian civilization would be one. But there are a lot of ways that we have not advanced much past what Greek and Roman philosophy and educational theory. And you're talking about 50,000 years ago up until 5,000 years ago is how long it takes man to get to building cities. And then suddenly, 500 years later, they're building pyramids. I mean, there's just an incredible explosion of human society. Let me show you on this chart here. Civilization. Here's 1550 AD to 200 AD, and then we're going to scroll backwards a little bit. You see the Byzantine Empire up here. You see down here is kind of the, I believe this is like North and South America. You've got Europe up here. This is Egypt up here at the top. This is 3100 BC, Egypt, with pyramids coming somewhere along in this area. Basically, suddenly bursting on the scene at this point in human history, about 3000 BC, you have, boom, human culture that is well developed. And we're supposed to have 40,000 years before that of man that can do all these other things, and we just don't have much evidence of it, and culture is not developing. I just don't think that passes the smell test. I think what you see here is much more similar to what the creation account of Genesis, when Cain is going and he goes out and builds a city, is that mankind, we are not smarter than people that lived 2,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago. We're not smarter. We have better technology than they have, but we're not smarter people. If it was true that mankind was just getting smarter and smarter over this 40,000 or 20,000 years, then we would continue to get smarter now. But I would argue that if you look at a true history of culture and civilization, that we are not smarter than people that lived back in those times. We have better tools and better technology, yes, but that does not equal getting better ethically, morally, educationally. In fact, we send our son to a school that uses the ancient Greek and Roman method of education because we believe that that method is actually superior to what you're seeing most of the time today in today's culture and today's education system. So what does that tell you? We think we actually got to go back. In fact, the Renaissance and Reformation time period in Europe, one of the, I think, high points of human civilization, there's a dip there when the Dark Ages and everything, but that was a rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman culture in a lot of ways. So what you have is not this continual trend upward, but what you have is people fully developed, formed with the image of God, going out building cities from the very earliest times, and just an explosion suddenly of human civilization. And that's what you see, and that's even what the using an evolutionary timeline, I think that's what you see. So I just don't think it passes the smell test for humans, early humans even, to have been around for 2.5 million years. And then early upright humans, Homo erectus, around, you know, these long, ridiculously long time periods where there's very little actual development. And then suddenly we see this huge upswing in all this development in the last 5,000 years. To me, it just doesn't make sense. So that was kind of my personal one, the explosion of human civilization. And then we have the appearance of life, which I think it may be the biggest hurdle for the evolutionists, is, okay, you believe that there was a big bang and that the Earth formed out of molten rock and everything like that. Well, at what point did life begin to exist? And what exactly brought non-life into the state of living? We don't have it. We can't do that ourselves with modern technology. You know, but I've heard some evolutionists say, well, given the right circumstances and everything, this primeval life could have developed and everything, and it doesn't make sense on many levels. That it's just, you don't have life that comes from non-life. Apart from if there's an outside being going to act, if God is going to make something that's dead come alive, then yeah, that can be. But if you exclude the possibility of God's supernatural intervention, we don't have any examples of non-life coming to life, even using our greatest technology, modern scientific advances, laboratory, creating any kind of environment that you want to create with any kind of variables that we could put together. We still cannot make something that's not alive come alive. And we're just supposed to believe that happened in the middle of a swamp somewhere. I mean, that may be an oversimplification of it, but at one level, that is really what has to happen in order for evolution to take place, at least the full evolutionary scheme. And I just don't think it passes the smell test once again. So, in all of this, I'm not ready to cast in my lot with the young Earth creationists that say, no, everything's 6,000 years old. Certainly not 6,000 years old. If you stretch it out to 10,000, I may be a little more likely to go along with it. Positing gaps in the biblical genealogies in that circumstance. So I'm not ready to throw in my lot with Ken Ham, but I certainly am not ready to jump in with these billions of year theories about the origins of the Earth, of life, of humankind either. So I'm kind of where Wayne Grudem is, that I don't feel like we can know with a whole lot of certainty, and certainly not enough that I'm going to be dogmatic and argue about it and split company. All other things being equal, I'm more comfortable with the young Earth. I'm going to tend toward that scenario, because I think it's much easier to think that, like I said, I do think we stand on the special creation of Adam and Eve, that they did not come from a common ancestor with primates. Adam and Eve were specially created by God. But outside of that, if you want to believe in some evolution of some species or long days in Genesis, I'm not going to argue too much with you about that. Like I said, I just don't know. I'm not enough of an expert in it to know. If you ask me which way do I lean, I feel more drawn toward the creationist narrative, because it certainly is a cleaner representation of what you see in Genesis 1 with the creation of Adam and Eve, especially from God. But like I said, I'm open to scientific evidence and to people saying, we see other things here. I'm willing to learn about it and see. Yeah, Will.
So, I mean, with the image you had there of the earliest civilizations, it seems like if you take the archaeological evidence, the oldest civilization is what where there's strong archaeological evidence is what, the Egyptian civilization. What's that?
Yeah, they say we've got Egypt up here. They've got Samaria right here, about 2,800. I was seeing about 3,500 in some of the other sources I was looking at today for the civilizations in the Mesopotamia area.
Yeah, they're probably affected by the whole radiological dating problem as well. But
yeah.
if the oldest archaeologically provable civilization is about 3,500 years old, and you believe there was a flood, if there were older civilizations and there, you would have evidence of them, but if there was a flood, it would have wiped them all out. So if you take the view that, the Egyptian civilization is the oldest, about 3,500 years, and the flood was, say the flood happened some hundreds or whatever years before that, and I guess Methuselah, he was like 1,000 years old. So that fits in really well with a 6,000-year-old Earth.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
Yeah.
If you start talking about different lengths of I'm not talking about the Earth, I'm not even worried about that, just human beings. Mm-hmm. When you start going beyond 6,000, there's so many uncertainties about, if it's 10,000, what was happening in all those other 4,000 years, it's just, it's not as ideologically or whatever the right word is, neat.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I agree. And I don't think the human civilization part, I don't think it compares with skeleton.
I think one thing to consider is with our, the time that we measure things as humans, with our finite minds, that paradigm of space-time, God exists outside of it. He created it. So trying to apply our knowledge of time, or how we perceive time and measure time, to a miracle from a holy, everlasting God, I think is our first mistake. I mean, it's fun to talk about, but like he said, who cares?
I agree with Ben. That's why I commented last week I said God's time.
Yeah, because,
we're on human time, our time.
I mean, we just can't comprehend it.
Yeah.
So, and then on one side you have faith, the creationist side. We don't understand it all, but we have faith in God. Mm-hmm. On the other side, you have the secular or atheist evolutionary argument, which is, I think, and this is my opinion, is based in human arrogance. Because anytime they're going to admit they're wrong, then they have to consider our position, or the faith position. So like you were saying a minute ago, like, oh, they found this rock and it's 200 million years old, but they found something else. Well, of course they have to adjust. They have to make it fit, because God forbid they're wrong. They'll never admit they're wrong.
Yeah.
So they have to make it fit their theory.
Yeah.
And in the theory of evolution, I'm almost done, promise. In the grand theory of evolution, there's actually 6 subcategories of evolution, and the only one that's ever been proven with the scientific method and observed is microevolution. Mm-hmm. The other 5 have never been observed, and you cannot apply the scientific method to them. You can't do it.
Yeah.
So it's not science.
Yeah, science is supposed to be repeatable and observable.
Yeah, it's not science.
And coming from the other perspective, I do want to make sure that I do get across. When you go back and look at some of these old fossils, now granted some of them are reconstructions of partial skull fragments and things like that, so you have to take that into consideration. But you look at some of these skulls that are said to be of early man, and it can be unsettling because you can tell that it's not a human skull. And so I want to deal fairly with people that are legitimately trying to put those things into an understanding, and they feel like the evolutionary viewpoint is the best way to fit that in and everything. And I think we just have to admit that we're not always sure exactly how do we take the fossil evidence, and how is it. We don't have all the answers as far as how to put it together the right way. Like this guy, Marvin Lubenow, he tries to put them in a framework, but there are criticisms about the way he does it too. So, I want to be fair, because there are some Christians that say, I'm a theistic evolutionist and I believe that God did that and everything. So, I'm not comfortable with that. I don't want to diminish the weight of some of the evidence that the scientific, the traditional scientific viewpoint gives, and there are some obstacles for the young Earth creationists to overcome. But like I said, I think there are some key points that creationists make about the problems with evolution and about the old Earth origins and things like that lend some credibility, that says maybe those obstacles can be overcome by this viewpoint. So, I'm ready to be done studying this, and my head can stop spinning, trying to understand it all. But yeah, so
I just wanted to say, I think there are two things that we're talking about, two separate things. One is human civilization, the other one is human beings as creations, creatures, or development of our personality, our bodies, or let me put it this way, development of creation of life, creation and development of life. Civilization, I believe that the idea of civilization is dependent upon God, who will allow us to know one more step forward. Mm-hmm. Like we've got the Industrial Revolution came at one time, exploded. At that time, God allowed us to know some more. And then since then came others like computer age and internet age and all these things that we know now. And just today, somebody landed on a meteor or something like that. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm saying God is looking at us and allowing humans to know one more thing that He already is all-knowing, but we are only capable of knowing so much at a time. I think that's human civilization thing, step by step, not a continuous thing, because that's not what it is. But like you said earlier, in terms of below our neck, below the neck, civilization, the people in order, and today, I don't think there's any difference. Just the way God created. And above that, as far as the mental knowledge is, that civilization issue is dependent upon what God is allowing us to know. So I think we have to separate. We are created the same way all the time from the beginning, but the civilization can go on step by step going. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just sort of as a follow-on to that, it just made me think. You know, they say that we only use about 10% of our brains, right? Well, when we get to heaven, you know, maybe we'll be using the other 90% to continue to learn, continue to grow, you know, and so forth.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah, there's that.
Yeah.
So to wrap up our question for tonight, whether or not dinosaurs and humans coexisted completely depends on whether you believe in the old Earth or the young Earth scenario. And I think it's plausible from a biblical perspective to believe that humans and dinosaurs did coexist. Were the dinosaurs on the ark is usually a prominent question that comes up because of that. Most dinosaurs were not that large, so it would have been possible. And if the large dinosaurs could have occupied the ark when they were at a young age, when they had not grown to full size. So It's possible for dinosaurs even to have been on the ark. That's not that hard of a problem to overcome in that scenario. So I think it's possible, and you can make that work. But like I said, it's not the end of the world to come down on one side dogmatically over the other on the young Earth, old Earth, and young Earth situation. So here's our next question for next week. If God loved the world, why would the Bible tell us not to love the world?
So goes the meaning of the word world.
So we'll talk about that next week and some others as well. I think the cremation question may be after this one. So, all right, let's pray before we head out tonight. Father, we thank you for the time to study and to think about the early civilizations and the early times of this world, and we confess that we don't know all the details about it. We know what your word says, and we know that we can trust your word. We're not sure how to put all the details and pieces of the puzzle together exactly as we might want to at times. But we trust your word, we trust what you tell us, and that you are not going to lead us astray. We thank you that you have created us in your image, and that you've given us the responsibility to steward the earth, to be morally responsible, to follow you and your word, what you've commanded us, and in the ways that we've fallen short of that, we thank you for your son Jesus, who's come to bring us redemption. God bless the time that we've had tonight. I pray that you would use it in our lives, together as a church and individually, and bring us back next week as well, in Jesus' name.